Okay, I think it's fair to say that when most people use the term critical race theory or the acronym CRT today in 2021, they're not likely referring to an obscure legal academic movement in the 90s. But what then are they actually talking about? Where did these ideas come from? How have they changed in the decades since its origin in the 90s? What does that all look like, and what does that mean for the controversy today? Well, that's kind of what I want to explore in this video. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, deep breath. So I'm going to try to cover a lot of territory in a short time. What I'm trying to do with this channel, with these videos, is distill and summarize in hopefully a concise and clear way big concepts. And whenever you do that, there's always the risk of oversimplification and overgeneralization. So I'm keenly aware of that, especially in this topic. That's such a lightning rod. Nevertheless, I think it's important enough to try because there's so many popular talking points that I want to try to wade in and try to nuance and complicate some of them. Okay, so what I want to do in that sense then is I want to build off of video 1 in this series, which if you haven't watched it, you might want to look at that if this topic is of interest, because I talked about and tried to unpack the origins, especially the academic and scholarship origins of what would become CRT. And I want to build off of that now and talk about a little bit about some trends in this field of scholarship that have emerged since those origins in the decades that have followed. So late 80s, early 90s to today. Now, probably unnecessary caveat or disclaimer, I'm not going to be able to cover everything. It's a complicated area of scholarship. Lots of people within CRT disagree with each other on various things. I'm not even going to try to get into all the weeds on that because I don't even understand all of that. But nevertheless, I do see at least two pretty broad trends in the scholarship, in the publications, in the work, the academic work and the popular work, that I think understanding these two trends, having language for these two trends, and seeing kind of the impact of them, I think really is helpful for trying to diagnose what's actually going on in our conversations today. And so I want to cover those two trends, those two branches, so to speak, of CRT. And they are, in my language, these two branches are, the first one is the historical study of race as a social concept, especially the historical study of race. And the second branch is the popular application of theoretical ideas, theoretical CRT ideas. So again, historical study of race, popular application of concepts. These are two branches of CRT that are pretty different, but nevertheless are under the same label of CRT, which actually is kind of part of the problem. So this first area, historical study, builds off of the work. It springs out of and is at least influenced by the work of people like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw that I covered in the first video, who identified the ongoing kind of nature, the permanence of racism in society, even though laws are changed and deconstructed to try to rectify those wrongs. Racism and inequality still exist. They identified that and kind of started to push on this concept of invisible racism that kind of gets embedded in society, right? So building off of that, an important kind of axiom or kind of baseline assumption of a lot of these critical scholars moving forward is that race, as a way of categorizing humanity into these subgroups, race is man-made as a concept, as an idea. It's a man-made concept that has real social implications. I talked about this a lot in video 4 of my anti-racism series, which might sound familiar because I'm going to echo some of those points. But the idea here is that we made up race, we made up these categorizations as these subgroups, but nevertheless they have real impact in society because they've been encoded into our social structures, laws, policies, and then culture and pop culture and media. It starts to get through all this, and this is that invisible racism again. It gets kind of in everything that we, kind of the ways we operate. And so the baseline assumption though is that it's been man-made, been human-made. And I mean, I'm resisting the temptation to go into so many different rabbit trails. I'm going to try to stay focused and concise here. But that's an important assumption to understand that's animating some of the scholarship, is then on a historical level to look back over history then, and if it was man-made, if race was man-made, then the idea is that good historical study will be able to reveal the man-madeness of it, where it comes from, where its origins are, especially in social structures, And then we'll be able to unwind its man-madeness, and get to a more socially just, racially just society. That's the idea. And the driver behind the historical study then is to look back over history, try to identify the man-made kind of ways that race appears and surfaces and functions, particularly to separate, to marginalize, to oppress. Now, some of the more, there is a even more critical, radical, I hesitate to use this term because it's such a buzzword, but truly Marxian or Marxist angle in some of the scholarship that would build off of that assumption and would say not only was race man-made, but it was man-made as a tool of oppression. That's an important nuance. Not just that it's man-made, but that it was man-made in order to oppress. Be that as it may, that's how some people operate with that assumption. Some people don't operate with it as much, but it's in the mix. It's important to be aware of. Okay, so let's peel this back a little bit. What I want to talk about is just point to some scholarship that exemplifies this historical study of race as a social construct, because I think it's really important to at least be aware of under the broader umbrella of CRT, or critical race theory. So one really pretty early and I would say is a watershed study is known as How the Irish Became White. I can't pronounce his last name. His first name is Noel, N-O-E-L. Came out in 1995. It was actually his dissertation that got released in book form, which happens a lot. But this is pretty important. Note the timing of it. 1995 is mid-90s. The origins that I covered were late 80s, early 90s. This is building out of that. And his study took an historical angle and asked the question, how the Irish become white? To put more detail to that, how did a much maligned, disliked, oppressed, marginalized group of immigrants from Ireland, how did they not only immigrate, but how did they eventually get included under the label of white? Right? Because it's important to understand, and this is historically verifiable, is that the Irish were considered racially inferior to whites for a long time. Whites were, at the time, really only Western Europeans, also including the British, the Germans, Franks, so on and so forth. The French. The Franks is the more historical tribal term. But the term white really only included those groups and did not include the Irish. They were excluded not only from the label white, but from all the cultural privileges and comforts and everything that's afforded by the label white, as the scholarship would portray it. And I think they're right about that. There is a certain privilege, comfort, luxury afforded to people who have access to the term white historically. And the Irish were excluded from that. They eventually became included under the label white, which is also true. And I have a strong thread of Irish ancestry in my family, and no one considers the Irish today to be not white. I mean, it's not even something that is thought of, which is fascinating to think about from a historical angle. That has not always been true. Anyways, I'm lingering on this a little longer than I meant to, but his study is it's such a helpful. It's helpful in the sense that it gets at some of what would become kind of critical whiteness studies, because he was starting to really try to interrogate historically this question of who has access to this term white. What does this term white mean? What kind of privileges and luxuries does it give people in a society in America that have access to it? And then what does it exclude from others? And the movement of the Irish into this label, this cultural label, was his historical project. And I think that's fascinating. And it's something that's important to be aware of, and it's one example of this leg of historical study of race, or race as a social construct, especially. Now, another book I want to point to is one I've mentioned in other videos, is Nell Painter's book, The History of White People, which is a book I still find helpful. It's a book that was very enlightening to me when I read it originally years ago. It came out in 2010, the other study I referenced was 95. This is 2010, so we're getting closer to kind of our current context now. But her book, she's an historian, and her book captures, again, a lot of this historical study. The book doesn't use the term critical race theory, and actually when I read this book, I didn't even know what critical race theory was. I never heard that term. She uses the more general term race theory, which is just a way to, again, analyze history and see where race has appeared and how have certain people been categorized and classified and excluded. And particularly, I must say, in the American historical scholarship context, this really focuses on the labels of white and black because of the specific history of America, particularly with the Atlantic slave trade. Don't need to go into all that right now, but that's just the focus there has largely been on white and black and has gradually started to include other racial groups into the kind of the study of trying to understand where they come from and what this has meant for people's existence in our society. So Nell Painter's book covers, and part of what I loved about it was it goes deep, way back to the actual tribes of the Germanic tribes, the Frankish tribes, the Angles. It goes way back to them, the origin of the term Caucasian. And she really covers, with impressive historical work, the development of the understanding of a white people group and how these actually very different tribes got kind of melded together under this, and then the implications of that into more modern society. It's a fascinating book, and I think a very worthwhile historical study, frankly. And it's just another example. One more quick example is from a theological angle is Willie Jennings' really important book, The Christian Imagination, which is like Nell Painter's book in some senses, but it brings in the angle of religion and theology, and how did especially the Western Christian church use theological concepts like God and being created humanity and sin and all of that. How were those concepts entangled and intermixed in the creation of race and racial categorizations of humans? He just brings in the historical theological angle and tries to expose, well, frankly, the church's historic kind of complicity in some of this stuff. It's an important book. It's a really, really helpful book. And part of what I want to say, why I'm harping on this branch, so to speak, is because for me, this branch, this subcategory of critical race theory scholarship is probably the most fruitful, the most helpful, the most intellectually challenging and provoking and stimulating and just genuinely intellectually enriching subset of critical race theory, for me, is this historical study. Asking hard questions about where does race come from, how was it constructed through our society, what are the impacts of that construction. It's really helpful stuff. It's been very, very paradigm impactful for me. And part of my concern with the way our dialogue is going is that with the general label of CRT kind of being so sloppily encompassing so much, is that for those who want to dismiss all of it, they miss out on this really, really fruitful branch of important scholarship. It's not to say all this scholarship's above critique. There's really good pushbacks to all the stuff I'm talking about. But this branch in particular, man, I just don't want to see it get just utterly dismissed, particularly by people like me who've benefited so much from it. So the historical creation of whiteness and the way certain people have been included in that and others excluded from it is just a real thing to be aware of. And it owes, to the extent that we're aware of it on a broader level today, it does owe quite a bit to this branch of critical race theory. All right, so let's talk about the second one. So if that's historical study of race, the second one is the popular application of these theoretical ideas. These theoretical being just like cultural diagnostic theory. So the popular application of these ideas. And I'm going to say at the outset, I think this is where a lot of the controversy is in this branch, is popular application. In Cynical Theories, which has a helpful chapter on critical race theory, they use the term popular and then reified postmodernism. So I'm using different terms for various reasons, but I think just the popular application is a helpful kind of handle to put on this. So one thing I want to say too is that in this general world of critical, cultural diagnostic, critical theory, which is bigger than CRT, which goes way back to the early 1900s in the Frankfurt School and stuff, whole other topic, right? But this whole critical cultural analysis, some of which has a Marxian lens to it, not all, but some of it does. There's always been a tension, a very felt tension between the theory, the abstract conceptualizing, and the concrete application. So abstract, conceptual, concrete application. There's always been a tension there, and it's embodied in the critical theory world by Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno, to simplify things a little bit. But there was a disagreement between the two of them between whether or not these ideas should remain theory, which is interesting. Should these remain theory and conceptual and more diagnostic focused, which is what an Adorno would say, Or no, should they be popularized and filtered down to people in an activist sense to encourage revolution and the overthrow of the oppressor and so on and so forth, which was the Marcusean sense. Herbert Marcuse was very famous for being very pro the student movement and the activist movement in the 60s. So he took a different tack on it. Interestingly, it seems like he nuanced that more by the end of his life and possibly regretted some of that view, which is interesting. Anyways, my point being, there's a tension here in this world. We're talking about a lot of academic stuff, scholarship stuff, really ivory tower kind of stuff. There's a tension between whether or not those ideas need to remain in the ivory tower, so to speak, or do they need to be brought out to the general public and encouraged in a particularly an activist revolutionary way. That tension exists in critical race theory, just like it does in all these other areas. And what I'm talking about now with this other branch of popular application is much more, you could say, Marcusean, in the sense that they want to encourage the average person to get these concepts and to change their life and to live differently and to do different things as a result of these ideas. Not all scholars would say that, but this particular branch is very clear that no, we want to, as Marx himself said, the point is not just to theorize about the world, the point is to change it. Okay, again, building off of some of the same kind of axioms. Race is invisible, or race can become invisible. Just because you've reversed some laws and policies doesn't mean you shouldn't assume racism is gone. And then the historical study angle brings in this whole idea of race being a socially constructed, man-made thing. Some of which have a more of a cynical, pessimistic view that it was created in order to oppress. That's kind of, well, I don't know if I want to bring in that whole other angle, but that is part of what animated some of the scholarship of the 1619 Project, which has actually been walked back and quietly kind of rolled back by the New York Times, because I think that some of it overstated its case, but man, that's a whole other topic. All this to say is a lot of these axioms and assumptions start to feed into each other, and the popular application branch wanted to then take these out to, again, the average person. And so the question becomes, okay, if all these things are true, if race is man-made, if it has a marginalizing, oppressive impact in society, it has a real impact on real people, if whiteness was made up and it has a fluid nature and certain people can be included, others can be excluded, if all of that is true, well then what are we supposed to do about it? How are we supposed to live? And this is where it's impossible to talk about this without talking about Robin DiAngelo. It's just impossible, because she is so clearly embodies this popular implied CRT lens. Notably, of course, in her book White Fragility, but probably even more so in her trainings that she does for corporations and for institutions of higher ed and all that. It's just impossible not to ignore her, right? So concepts that she's popularized, in particular white fragility, or the idea that to be white, just to be white, to be born white in our country is to be born racist. That's something that she talks about very explicitly in White Fragility. Or the popularization of the idea that racism is not just prejudice, but it's prejudice plus power. So you have to be in a powerful social position in order to be racist. That's also something that's kind of comes out of this applied CRT idea. Even just the very concept of social location is kind of influenced by some of this popular applied CRT, as I'm calling it. So a lot of these things, particularly in the ways that certain people are encouraged to change the ways that they think about the world and their place in it and how they're supposed to interact with others. That is all examples of applied, what I'm calling a popular applied CRT. Now, another example that I want to bring up about this, and again, this is really, I said this already, but I really, really believe that this is more of the pressure point of the controversy, because this is where people are getting trained. People are being trained in certain buzzwords right now, and the training, by virtue of the training, is trying to encourage people to think differently, and the application of these ideas, and particularly, I'm gonna do a whole video on whether or not this stuff should be taught in schools, because that's an interesting question, but this is the pressure point, is the application to people's lives. No one would be worried if all this stuff remained in the ivory tower and remained conceptual and just was traded around in academic journals that hardly anyone can afford subscriptions to anyways. No one would be worried, but that's not the case anymore. These things have been filtered down and intentionally tried to be popularized and pushed out. This video is starting to get long, so I'm going to try to wrap it up here in a second. But what I want to do, I want to end on just two more things. I want to say that I'm going to bring another popular figure into this, because I think he typifies both of these branches, and that is Ibram Kendi, someone I've mentioned several times. Everyone probably knows who he is, who's watching this. His career, his writing career, interestingly exemplifies both of these branches, I think, because his 2017 book, which is a massive book, Stamped from the Beginning, which I've read, is an historical study. It's the first branch. The history, a definitive history of racist ideas in America, I think is the subtitle. So he catalogs through primary writings, journals, policies, laws, government documents, what he sees as the kind of origins of all these racist ideas historically. Where do they come from? How can you point to these, like, you know, ink on paper, here you can see racist ideas in society. That's what that book's about. So it really perfectly embodies his first branch. And I found his book helpful. I have real questions and critiques and concerns of some of his other side of his work, which is embodied by his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which fits right into the popular application side of what I'm talking about, right? How to be an anti-racist, how to live and how to think and how about policies and conduct yourself. So anyways, I just think it's fascinating that his two books in his career really, really capture kind of both of these angles, the historical study and the popular application. And I want to end on this final thought. This has been helpful for me as I think about trying to wade through all of this work and make some sense of it. There is a real difference between descriptive and prescriptive work. Descriptive, prescriptive. And you can see how this maps over probably. But to be descriptive is to try to take a diagnostic look at what's going on in the world. And I think a lot of the scholarship in the historical analysis side fits under this descriptive side. And I have... you can have lots of conversations. None of it's above critique, right? You can have lots of conversations in critiquing people like Nell Painter's work. Nevertheless, if it remains intently descriptive to describe what's happening, that's very different from prescriptive, which is to say, now this then is how you should live. You should prescriptively act in a certain way. In my 4-part video series in which I catalog my own journey through kind of anti-racism ideas personally, I talk, particularly I think in video 3, about my own attempt to apply these concepts to my life and how the filters I took on and the ways that I tried to change my paradigm and how I interacted with people in different settings. And I really lived a genuine attempt to live out a lot of these applied ideas on a popular level. And so you can watch that video if you want to hear me talk a little bit more about that experience. But nevertheless, I think this descriptive versus prescriptive lens can be helpful for trying, again, what I'm trying to do is thicken and complicate and nuance this simplistic label of CRT, because so many people are batting it around. But there's so much underneath that label that needs much more careful thought and understanding. And the descriptive historical side of this scholarship, I think, has much to commend it. And the prescriptive one is where I think actually the real controversy is and where the applied popular questions lie. And that's kind of where I want to go with maybe a next video, is I want to start to think about what are the good and bad faith critiques of CRT, what are the ones worth talking about, what are the ones that I think are just not helpful or lazy, intellectually lazy critiques, and maybe we can explore some other topics along those lines. So I'm going to end this video here. This definitely has gotten longer than I meant, but I hope this was helpful. This topic is so important right now, and I get the sense that a lot of people really want just ongoing dialogue about it. So if this brings up questions for you, other books, other scholars you've thought of or been exposed to, just topics along this line you'd like me to maybe explore, just let me know. I want this to be helpful. I hope that this is at minimum thought-provoking, potentially challenging, or hopefully enlightening. So thanks again for checking this out.